Now the conversation is going to get fun because we have Nancy here. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Glad to be part of this.
I am excited and nervous all at the same time, so this is going to be so much fun.
Great combination.
Yes. So we want to talk about the Leader's Challenge. There's this temptation when it comes to stepping into moments of leadership where, you know, you're out, you want to build something. I know I'm wired that way. Like, give me something to build. I want to build something. But we can find ourselves distracted by building the wrong thing. So I want to go to that. But before that, here's a question that I'd love to pose for both of you. Is everyone a leader?
Yep, and I'll jump in and then you can disagree.
Whenever.
I think one of the challenges around leadership is it is a fraught, weighted word with multiple meanings. And I, in particular, make two different distinctions. On the one hand, every human being is made in the image of God, and God said that I will give you dominion. And so we were all created to be difference makers. We all have a need to be significant. We all have a need to have impact. In the book of Revelation, at the end of the Bible, it talks about how one day all of the saints will sit on thrones. So what's that about? Mm-hmm. It's not about, you know, we're going to be having a lazy boy. Yeah. It's an image of reigning or ruling that we were made. So we all have a kingdom. We all have a will, and that will is meant to be powerful and creative in the service of the good. And so in that sense, absolutely, everybody was meant to be a leader. We don't want to be lemmings or sheep. We want to have a strong moral compass. We don't want to cave into peer pressure. So in a very deep way, I think that's part of where to say somebody is not a leader has become an insult and demeaning to their sense of worth and personhood. And I've had somebody in my life say to me, "You're not a leader, you don't have a leadership bone in your body," and it felt very demeaning and insulting.
And I think it was intended to be that.
That's another story and a better one. So there's, in that sense, everyone is a leader. Then there's also leadership in a narrower sense that might be called organizational leadership or the leadership of a group, or I think the spiritual gift of leadership. Paul talks in the letter to the church at Rome about the spiritual, if you have the spiritual gift of leadership, then lead. And in that sense, I think it's a bit more like evangelism or giving, where we're all to evangelize and we're all to give, but some people have particular wiring that makes them especially alive and gifted in this area. And I think that leadership in that narrower sense will involve things like the ability to develop people and the ability to build a team, the ability to think strategically. People who are leaders in that sense, I think, have a bias towards action. And there's other people that by nature are contemplative. They're equally made in the image of God, equally able to carry out the task of dominion, but it will be in a bit of a different way. And I think what can happen is, on the spiritual formation side, people that are really drawn to that will sometimes fail to appreciate that spiritual gift of leadership in the organizational sense. And I can remember reading an academician, he was a Christian thinker, but he really did not appreciate at all that notion of the spiritual gift of leadership. So he'd say things like, when a group meets, we should just have rotating leadership and anybody can lead the group. And he didn't recognize the fact that there are some people who are wired to be much better at leading a meeting than other folks. And they'll have a sense of, are we on track? Are we on task? Are you not interested anymore? Do you need to be challenged? And we've all been in meetings where there's somebody who's really gifted at leading them or somebody who's not. Mm-hmm. Coaching is that way. There are some people where they just have gifts to be able to coach. They're able to say, hey, you need to be challenged right now, but you need to be encouraged. And so when there's the failure to recognize and celebrate the spiritual gift of organizational leadership, then the organization suffers. Yeah. And that's part of a craft that God created, just as artistry is, and learning and teaching is, and counseling and encouraging is. So that's a problem, I think, that often people who consider themselves champions of spiritual formation will make. And I'll think, for example, Eugene Peterson, who I love, that I learned so much from, doesn't often write about that dimension of leadership. And he will talk about pastoring, shepherding quite a lot. He'll express a lot of frustration that the church is turning into a group of shopkeepers. Well, actually, keeping shop is a perfectly legitimate craft, and there's stuff that we can learn from that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think often in high leadership cultures, they will tend to idolize this gift of leadership. And then anybody who doesn't have that is demeaned and talked about as not being a leader. And people will feel like, if I don't have that gift, then I don't count. So I somehow have to make myself feel like I have that gift or feel like a second-class citizen. And understanding the sense in which everybody is going to reign, was made to have a kingdom or a queendom, and is equally significant. And that, in fact, we have to especially be careful for those parts of the body that are not the most visible or the most honored, as Paul said. That often happens on places where they love the let's take the hill leadership side. And so I think part of what we want to be about is holding both of those together. So I'll stop there.
I have nothing to add to that. I think that's
Oh, come
terrific.
on.
No.
You can't disagree with any of it?
Give me time.
Yeah.
No, I thought that was great. I agree.
So you said a narrower way of thinking about leadership is organizational leadership.
Yes.
And sometimes in this high leadership culture, climate, we would never say it's a narrow view. That's the main thing. We're here for that.
Yeah.
And that's a space you live in terms of talking to leaders, training leaders, coaching, just all of that. How do we wrestle with that? How do you lead through that?
I don't think there's a wrestling. If I need to feel like what I do is more important than somebody else or that it's the whole game, I'm probably not centered in the way I should be. But to be able to say, yes, my leadership is the narrow contribution I can make to the goal of the kingdom, that's the right place to be. Leadership just gets put up on a pedestal sometimes in ways that are quite goofy and add pressure to the leader. And there's certain kinds of pressure that come with leadership, absolutely. But it's not a more important gift than anything else. And I think good leaders recognize that. The best definition I've ever heard of leadership is creating a way for people to contribute to make something extraordinary happen. So
and would you say that's leadership that where everybody's leader with the image of God, or is that the more narrow?
It's a little bit of the more narrow, I think.
I think so too.
But if I'm going to create an environment where people can contribute, I better value their contributions as important as mine. So I think to put leadership in the right place, it's one of many gifts. It's not really mentioned all that much in Scripture. But we've turned it into an industry. It's important, but the importance is catalyzing all of the other gifts and valuing them as important.
There's obviously different types of leadership. Or leadership roles, positional, situational. This is a little bit of my space where I came from, so I'm curious to hear, how has technology has it changed it, impacted it? Is it different today, or is it the same? Thoughts on that?
Well, one way that it's shifted it is like a whole nother runway for leaders now is just influencers. I don't remember people used to being called influencers. But now with online technology available, that notion that I can create a platform and build my own brand and then count how many people are my followers and become an influencer at some level. That didn't used to be a thing, and it's become a thing. And it can be a good thing if it's used to influence people in good ways and point people towards love and flourishing, but it can become very addictive and can cause me to just look for ways to try to get more and more followers. And folks who write about that will say, there was a guy back in the 60s, a psychiatrist, Donald Winnicott, and he talked about the false self. And that when we present an image to other people that is not congruent with our actual insides, we start to feel hollow. And I think the online world makes that way even more tempting and more possible, the curated self that it used to be.
I think it's also opened up a lot of possibilities. I think technology is a tool, and if we keep it in that right place so it serves the vision and serves the work that we do, I feel like I'm able to meet with a lot more people because I'll look at my meetings and think, these are perfectly suited to Zoom. These need to be in person. But I can get done in a morning what with my job, driving around the
Yeah.
Bay Area might take me a couple of days.
Yeah.
I also think you extend your reach of people that you can pull together for the cause in good ways. But I think it just also so easily pulls narcissism out of us. And, when you look at how many people are following you, you got one person that follows 25 people, and that one person got counted 25 times, and you're feeling good about it. Like, that's crazy.
I got 4% of one person.
That's right. That's right.
I remember stepping into my role as an online pastor, and I was actually at one of our physical locations, and I thought, oh my goodness, I've got to rethink this whole thing. How do I pastor online? And I know a lot of people, I made the choice to become an online pastor. I know a lot of people were thrust into that role. They weren't asking for it. But what I've found was there were many things that were similar, because yes, it's a different platform, but it's still people, and you're still dealing with relationships, and your lobby looks different.
Yes, but I think the distinction between form and essence is really important. The essence is the same. The form is shifted, and that can be a good thing. But if you keep going back to the essences, I'm trying to help people, I'm trying to engage people, trying to challenge people, that's the same.
The temptation is often to, especially with social media, is you're trying to build your following. And in a way, we can say we're trying to build our kingdom. But that's not what God's calling us to do. He's calling us to build his kingdom. How have you guys been able to navigate that in your own spaces together?
Yeah, part of the journey for me has involved recognizing limits to my kingdom and the nature of Nancy's. So when I was growing up, I had this need to think of myself as a leader.
Yeah.
And I think that's been part of the complexity of that journey. That word was so vague and important that I had
That's just a bad combination too, isn't it? Vague and
Yep. And I had no sense of that distinction between being made in God's image and having worth and wanting to make a difference, and doing the kind of organizational leadership tasks that are really important. And so I was made to do this. As I understand myself now, leadership as a spiritual gift would not be real prominent in that mix for me. But when I was starting out in ministry, I would have been incapable of seeing that. Emotionally, I was way too attached to the need to think of myself as a leader. And so it took a long time for me to realize, I don't know that I'm really energized by the tasks of leadership in that way. Marcus Buckingham has a nice definition of strengths. He says, a strength is something that when you're doing it, you feel strong. And so if I'm learning, I'll have this sense of, oh yeah, I love doing this. I feel able to do it. When I'm communicating, at least sometimes I'll have that sense. Leading, not nearly as much. And then I married somebody who had leadership gifts that were much stronger than mine and was a woman. So that was a whole nother issue I've come to grips with. I'm the man, men are supposed to be the leaders, and yet I'm married to this person. And so there was a period of time where it's very painful for me to say, Nancy has leadership gifts that are way in excess of mine. And then after struggling with that, and finally, the thought that was really helpful was, do I want to be the kind of man whose wife would have to underfunction for me to feel good about myself? And it's like, no, I know I don't want to be that. Whatever else I know or don't know, I don't want that. Then eventually I was able to get to the place where there was great freedom, and I love those gifts in you and love watching them flourish and cheer them on. And so it's very easy. But it's been a journey from blindness to pain to freedom.
Because you felt like her ministry was thriving, but yours wasn't.
And his was.
Yeah, but it's just how he was viewing.
It's just the pain of comparison and the death that it causes in you of comparison. Couple thoughts. I grew up. I don't think I ever really heard the word leader until we were at a church in the Midwest that really focused on it in some good ways and some bad ways. I just knew I loved facilitating conversations that led to outcomes or something like that. So I think that was different for me. I didn't have it named. And I would give my right arm to be able to preach like John, to be able to read at the level he reads and retain it and then synthesize it into something.
Oh my, yes.
It's kind of annoying. But I can't do that. So it's this sin of comparison that I think gets in the way of us leaning into what God made us to be instead of looking over and saying, oh, I wish I was like her. And you always want to be like the best part of somebody else. So pretty soon I've collected 25 people that I want to be like, but only the best parts of them. Well, that's impossible.
Yeah.
And for me, John 21, where Jesus says to Peter, somebody's going to lead you to where you do not want to go, follow me. And Peter immediately, we often think if Jesus just told us what to do, we'd do it. I don't think we would. Peter says immediately, what about him? And Jesus' response to Peter's sin of comparison with John is more vitriolic than what the woman caught in adultery. What is that to you if I allow him to remain alive until I return? What is it to you if he gets such a great story that everything is up and to the right in his life and yours is awful? Follow me. I know. I live in that. And then how do I recognize comparison when it's invading my soul? How do I challenge it? And then how do I get to the point where I celebrate the gifts in somebody else, and I'm kind of blown away by, man, what could we do if we all came together?
Yeah. You've said this when we've talked about it. You don't see a difference between organizational leadership, like if it's done the right way and building the kingdom of God.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
I think organizational leadership is a component of kingdom leadership.
Yes.
It's not the only piece of it. And then I think looking at the values of Jesus and challenging our own leadership. Like I do think understanding certain business principles for leadership in the church is great because, like John said, running a business, running a shop, that is their ministry. I think when it leads us, that's when it becomes a problem. So how do I put it in the right place? And then I did a talk years ago called If I Had Been Jesus' Leadership Consultant. And I kept thinking, I hope they understand sarcasm. But I was like, okay, Jesus did things very differently than we're often taught to do. And 4 things I would have written him up and put him on a performance plan for is maximizing. We always want to maximize our time. He spent less than 10% of his life doing his ministry. He's called to build a kingdom. What does that have to teach me? His language. If you want to start a movement, you use language around seismic shifts and tsunamis, not salt and light and yeast and seed. So what was Jesus trying to tell us about the disproportionate impact of small things that I lose track of? His team. Seriously, his team.
Yeah.
Matthew the tax collector, Simon the zealot.
And part of what we talk about with teams is like it's important to have chemistry. His team didn't have chemistry.
That word I really object to. That's going back to the jocks and the cheerleaders. An affinity. Boy, if the gospel is anything, it's like I'm connected to you not because of affinity, but because of a love of another kind.
Yes.
And then the last one was his succession plan. He gives the keys of the kingdom to the disciple that he most publicly corrected, to Peter.
Get thee behind me, Satan.
Like, stop. Why? So we have a lot to learn. And then we also have a lot to learn from sound business principles. Jesus saying, what if you would build a tower without calculating the cost ahead? It's all part of the spiritual journey of the kingdom.
Yeah, and I think I was talking to somebody just this week whose husband's gone to work for a very large corporation. And her comment was, he finds the people who are managers and supervisors there more pastoral than people that he'd worked with in a church setting.
Yeah.
And sometimes in churches, it's easy for people to say, oh, you're getting too corporate, and not recognize there are corporations that are far more caring and pastoral and humane than churches are.
Those 2 things are not exclusive.
No. And
They're
it's like,
just not.
From God's perspective, he just has the one kingdom and it's everything. And so when he said to human beings, exercise dominion, that's like make clothes, make phones, raise food, beautify the earth, create culture. That's all part, that is the kingdom. So our jobs are the primary place where we experience discipleship, and we are called to align our kingdom with his kingdom. That is the main thing. And unfortunately, too often in churches, and I think there can be a bit of ego in this, we start to equate church work with kingdom work. And so it's like, well, I know you have your jobs, but then you come to my church and contribute to the kingdom.
Do ministry.
Do ministry.
And it becomes a way to try to get people to do what I want them to do, because that will extend my sense of feeling good, rather than recognizing, no, our job as the church is to help the kingdom spread all over the world.
But John, I have volunteer goals. I have goals, John. I can't.
No, and it's like, it's like using steroids. It's trying to grow in inappropriate ways that eventually are going to cause damage and teach the wrong lessons and keep the church from being the church all the time in every place. Yeah.
And to hold that tension, you do have volunteer goals, and people have lives, and you have to live in between those two things.
Yeah.
So how do we, as a leader, how do I lead my team in a way we are going after those the goals and the metrics and all, like we're being good stewards of what has been entrusted to us. At the same time, we're creating a culture where it's not about our kingdom and it's about his kingdom. How do you do that well?
Boy, so many thoughts in my head right now. I think you described it really well. A couple of thoughts. When you say the word metrics, I think metrics are good and fraught. I love that word.
Yeah.
So how do we talk about that as a team? We've set these goals. We want to pursue them. We want to hold ourselves accountable to them. And yet we realize that we are in the job of doing things that are out of our control.
Yeah.
When I set metrics and we go after them strongly, I also run the risk of building an inauthentic culture that won't admit they've made mistakes, that will hang on to something too long, that will feel shame when they don't. And those are at odds with each other.
Sure.
So I have to create an organization. I'm just reading a book right now called The Fearless Organization that's not afraid to fail. What does that mean? And then challenging, at what point and what kind of metrics fit into this kind of work? It's different than creating a product where you need to have a different kind of metrics. When I think about our family, did we have metrics? Well, yes, but they didn't look like business metrics. So creating a way where we can talk about the failure of metrics and the strength of metrics, and also facilitate people admitting mistakes, learning from mistakes, not being shamed by them.
Yeah. So if that's what we're called to do, build a kingdom, how then, as a pastor or a leader in a church, how do we define success? Because and I think this question has always been there, but it's risen to prominence, especially during COVID, because all of a sudden it's not nickels and noses anymore. We can't count the way we used to count, and everything's online, and it's like, does that even count? Is that real? And there's just like, we started wondering, okay, what is real? And there is a place for that. I do agree. And so it's that tension. As a leader, how do I define success in a way that's healthy for my soul, but also true to the organization that I'm called to lead?
I think going back to that distinction between outwardly and inwardly. So success is another word, one of those words that's very fraught.
We're going to do a whole nother talk. Yeah.
And to be effective, that's a really important word. To be fruitful, that's a really important word. Success often carries connotations of looking successful and being applauded. So I want to be careful about not trying to have the appearance of a successful person. The church where we were at for many years, Menlo Park, its shadow mission was named by its previous pastor many years ago, a successful church for successful people. That was the shadow
Now
mission.
that sounds good, like real, oh, there's not anything bad. But if you take a second to think about it, it's like, wait, is that real?
Well, and if you
Imagine Jesus choosing that as his
I was just
model.
going to say, if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and look at success metrics and failure metrics, which one would rise more quickly?
So,
well, and you've talked about this too, where how do you create goals to where the Pharisees and the Sadducees don't
you're not
win?
producing them. Yep. So to begin with, whether it's the word successful or effective or fruitful, to begin in the inner world of, am I becoming the kind of person God wants me to be? And am I leading out of that? But then also to look at the external world. I think there'll be some people, churches, especially folks that were more in the mainline world, that just got used to ineffectiveness, or sometimes in the spiritual formation world, if they're afraid of facing reality, where it's like, as long as I can help one fainting soul, put one bird back in its nest, it was, it's
You're making a lot of money for one bird.
It's possible for someone to preach really bad sermons and for someone to lead really bad meetings. So to look at are folks attending? And if it's gone down, is it because we're not meeting needs and being effective? And we'll seek to address that and allow the goals to be present, inform us, but never worship them. It has to start on the inside, but then there does have to be a rigorous dealing with concrete external metrics in the outer world.
wrote it down, and I feel like this is the theme. Jesus is our leader in leadership, and we just need to continue to go back to him, go back to the example that he has lived for us. So, Nancy.
And one of the words that gets talked a lot about in leadership is scale, and lots to say about that. But in just the few minutes we have left, when Jesus talks about salt and light and yeast and seed, I think one of the things he's telling us is, I have built into the universe scale.
Oh, yes. I love that.
You don't like going.
We got time, Nancy. Come on, we got time.
If I plant, and I've done this before, plant a bunch of seeds outside. Like, I don't go dig them up every day to see how the root system's growing. I trust that the seed will do what the seed will do over time.
So he's not against scale. And I think that's what sometimes people get nervous about. Like, oh, it's good that you're talking about all this. Like, you just want things to stay small. No, God invented scale. Right. He knows all about it.
Seeds and yeast won't stay small.
Yes.
And salt is the kind of thing that nobody goes to a restaurant and they get home and go, man, the salt was amazing. Wasn't that salt good? But if it wasn't there, you would think the meal wasn't good.
Yes.
It's all these disproportionate impact of small things and behind the scenes, things that you're not paying attention to, but are doing their work.
No, what I was thinking as you were talking about how do you develop teams, how do you have conversations around metrics, and I love that. I don't think I've ever heard that before. God built scale into the universe. So, the question there is, am I seeing growth and or am I forcing scale?
Yes. And
so that if there's not growth, then I'm going to ask, why is there not? What's blocking that? Be really open. But then if I think I can force scale, if I make myself look better, sound smarter, manipulate people more, I can grow my whatever more and more. And anytime we start forcing scale, then
it's
we're
mostly about
playing
ego.
God. Yep.
And when you look at vineyards need winter to produce good grapes. They need the time where the vines are completely bare. And then a great vineyard produces grapes 6 weeks out of the year. 6 weeks. So all the rest of the stuff is growing up to that. And I wonder sometimes in our impatience to scale, if we pull the plug on things when we weren't too far away from seeing the results, because the natural fermentation, the natural process that's built into the universe is at work.
That's so good. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is not how do I define success, but am I seeing growth or am I forcing scale?